Bob and MaryAnn planned their first date on a Tuesday, the first day of spring. A neatly dressed Bob was a little excited as he parked his shiny new car in front of the fine dine restaurant. He was in good spirits as he stepped out of his car and smiled at the valet. He quickly scanned the area, hoping to see his date MaryAnn waiting for him. MaryAnn was a cute young lady that he'd recently met at the vegetarian grocery store. He struck up a conversation with her, and it flowed so well and naturally that she had agreed to meet up with him for dinner. Bob chose the restaurant, and MaryAnn insisted that they meet there rather than have him pick her up. Bob completely understood that it was probably a safety precaution for MaryAnn. He told her that meeting up was a perfect idea. So here he was, outside the restaurant, ready to enjoy his time with MaryAnn. He was lost in thought for a minute or two when the guy in the red jacket cleared his throat and said, "Sir, may I have your keys, please?" with a slightly annoyed look on his face. Bob smiled and continued to stall, hoping that his date would walk up and see him getting his shiny new car valet parked. Bob finally gave up waiting and handed his key to the now confused valet, who quickly handed him a ticket and drove his car away. Bob entered the restaurant, looked around, and saw MaryAnn sitting at the bar having a drink. He slid up to the bar next to her and said, "Hey, pretty lady." She turned, saw Bob, and smiled pleasantly. She was happy to see that her date had finally arrived. Bob was fashionably late, and MaryAnn showed no signs of being bothered by the extra 10 minutes that she'd spent waiting for him. In fact, while she waited, she decided to order drinks and have the maitre d' prepare a table for two. Bob apologized for his tardiness. He smiled as he spoke, his eyes surveying MaryAnn. He looked her up and down from head to toe, nodding his head approvingly. Just then, the maitre d' approached the couple and led them to their table. Bob pulled out the chair for MaryAnn, who smiled genuinely, apparently impressed by his wonderful display of chivalry. She thanked Bob for having such nice manners. Bob then mentioned how it was nothing, as he always does the polite thing. Then he began telling her about how he's received so many compliments his whole life on his impeccable manners. His story seemed to be unnecessarily long and detailed, MaryAnn thought. By the time Bob finished his story, the waiter had brought them menus, silverware, and was now ready to take their drink order. Bob was so engrossed in his story that he did not notice the waiter standing there for almost a full minute. Finally, Bob ended his story with a hearty laugh. He seemed to really enjoy telling that story, MaryAnn decided. He didn't even notice that about halfway through the story, MaryAnn started looking over the menu. After they ordered drinks, the small talk began. They talked about their respective days and their thoughts and feelings about movies they had recently seen. The drinks arrived, and Bob sipped his wine. Right away, there was a slight frown on his face. He noticed MaryAnn's curious glance and said to her that this was clearly not a vintage year, as he raised his glass. MaryAnn nodded and thought to herself that her drink was absolutely perfect. Bob went on to begin naming all the much fancier places that he had been to, all of which served what he called way better drinks. Without missing a beat, Bob then listed all the very expensive drinks and foods that he had sampled from his very many travels to exotic foreign places. "Do you travel much, MaryAnn?" he asked. Before she could answer, he began talking about how people need to get out of their comfort zone and see the world. He then told her how he had visited Europe several times, as well as the Caribbean, Asia, and so on. MaryAnn had a fixed smile on her face, trying to conceal the fact that she had stopped listening somewhere in the middle of his story. Bob continued to speak for several more minutes. She vaguely heard him talk about his car, his job, and his income. He may have even spoken more about his travels, his jewelry, and all the very important people that he knew personally. She was not completely sure about the last part because by now she had mentally checked out and was engaged in a beautiful daydream. Their empty glasses sat on the table as he talked and talked. A confused waiter had visited their table twice to see if they wanted more drinks or were ready to order. Once again, Bob was so involved with his fantastic stories that he was unaware of the poor guy's presence. MaryAnn's smile was beginning to sag at the corners, and her cheeks began to tire from holding the forced smile in place for so long. Her neck was even becoming sore from nodding her head every 30 seconds for what was beginning to feel like forever to her. She glanced at her watch, wondering how she had managed to get herself into a date situation with a guy so in love with himself. This guy basically thinks that he's God's gift to women, she thought. Just then Bob basically confirmed her thoughts as she heard him say, "A woman would really be fortunate to snag a catch like me. Being such a well-bred gentleman of culture in a world where real men were few and far between made guys like me a real rarity." Bob then stopped talking and looked at MaryAnn. Clearly he was waiting for some sort of reply or confirmation from her. She tried to speak, but she needed a minute to move and stretch her jaw muscles back to their normal state. Finally, she coughed and said, "That's so awesome." She would have smiled again, but she felt like her cheeks needed at least a week's rest and recuperation. Bob opened his mouth to speak again, but she cut him off, saying politely that she had a very early day tomorrow and that she had a wonderful time, but unfortunately needed to head home now to get some rest. Bob nodded his head and mentioned that he completely understood. As he rose from his seat, he told her how next time he was going to really show her how the other half lives. Mary replied, "Oh my." Bob attempted to pull out MaryAnn's chair for her, but she quickly stood up, pushing the chair out for herself. Bob motioned to the waiter, who brought over the check for their drinks. MaryAnn offered to pay her share of the $20 tab. This made Bob laugh. He told her that a refined gentleman always covers the expense, especially since this was a mere pittance. He announced loudly in MaryAnn's direction that he was leaving the waiter a $20 tip. MaryAnn had begun to quickly walk toward the exit, with her back to Bob. Bob placed cash on the table and walked briskly to catch up with MaryAnn. They exited the restaurant together, and without a word, she headed off toward the parking lot. Bob said, "Hey MaryAnn, hold up for a second." She turned to face him. There was no smile on her face now. She watched him hand the valet his ticket and heard him say, "Hey, there's an extra 20 in it for you if you get my car here ASAP." He turned back toward MaryAnn, who was now only half-heartedly trying to conceal the fact that she was now rolling her eyes at Bob. Bob said to her, "You almost forgot to give me your number so we could plan our next epic date. That would have been terrible for you, he chuckled. Bob seemed to be so pleased with himself, she thought. Through the entire date, Bob had been oblivious to MaryAnn's expressions and signs that she was not enjoying herself by any stretch of the imagination. The normal imagination, she thought. She stared blankly at Bob. Her mind sifted through the several replies that she would enjoy giving him right now. After a moment's hesitation, she slowly walked toward him, and as she walked, she reached into her purse, pulled out a piece of paper and a pen, and started quickly scribbling onto the paper. She half smiled at Bob, folded the piece of paper, and leaned in very closely to him. She placed her mouth next to his ear and whispered seductively as she placed the folded paper into his jacket pocket. What she said to him was, "Good things are worth the wait, right? See if you can wait to see my number until you get home and are sure that I'm really worth your precious time." She stepped back, smiled, and looked him in the eyes. As she turned to walk away, she noticed that a huge, smug smile had appeared on his face. Bob watched her walk away and disappear quickly into the night. MaryAnn reached her car, locked the doors, and quickly sped away in the direction of her home. She turned on the radio and smiled contentedly as Bob and the restaurant disappeared from view. When Bob's car arrived, he tipped the valet generously. He started it up and drove away, engine revving loudly. He checked his rearview mirror. He looked at his reflection and let out a sigh and smiled a very satisfied smile. This had been a pretty good first date, he thought to himself. When Bob got home, he realized that he was famished and proceeded to prepare a meal for himself, after which he showered and got dressed for bed. Just as he was turning down the lights, he remembered the folded paper in his coat pocket. He located the jacket and pulled the folded paper out of the pocket. This one might actually be worthy, he thought to himself and chuckled loudly. He unfolded the paper and his smile faded and was replaced with a confused look. He read the words on the paper over and over again. MaryAnn had written in bold letters, "Go fuck yourself, Mr. Awesome." Bob read the message on the folded paper once more before he concluded, "Oh well, at least her dumb ass recognized that I'm awesome."